Chloe Ainsworth knew something was wrong the second her hand touched the door. It wasn't locked. It should have been. Mara never left it open, not even for a minute, not even by accident. So when the door rested only an inch ajar, leaning into the hallway like a quiet warning, it felt less like an entryway and more like a threat. Her chest tightened. She pushed the door wider. The apartment greeted her with a silence so heavy it felt hostile, as if the room itself understood something awful had already taken place. The lamp was on. The air was still warm. Mara's shoes sat exactly where she had left them that morning, lined up perfectly, untouched. Chloe whispered her name once, then louder still. Nothing answered back. On the small table near the entryway, the mug Mara used for evening tea was still giving off a faint warmth. The keys she always carried sat neatly in the ceramic bowl. None of this matched the open door. None of this matched comfort. None of this matched safety. That's when the realization hit her hard and fast. Someone else could have walked through that door. Someone who shouldn't have. And if something like this can happen without a single warning, what else can slip past you unnoticed? Don't wait until danger walks into your life unseen. Hit subscribe now. And if you refuse, go to the comments and tell us why. Because ignoring moments like this never ends well. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. If you're a fan of true crime and cold case investigations, you won't want to miss our new book, 50 Cold Cases Solved. 50 real stories of the world's most notorious cases where time almost erased the truth until one clue changed everything. Now available for instant digital download. You'll find the link in the video description and in a pinned comment. Now, let's dive into today's case. Chloe stepped farther into the apartment, each footstep feeling heavier than the last. The silence wasn't just quiet, it felt wrong. This was a home that normally carried life. Mara worked late nights, always humming while sketching out ideas, always filling the air with motion and energy. But tonight, the place felt frozen, as if time had stopped the moment she vanished. The drafting bag Mara never went anywhere without leaned against the wall untouched, one strap slightly twisted, like she dropped it in a hurry. Her phone charger still sat in the outlet. Her jacket hung neatly by the door. These were the tiny details that usually meant routine, comfort, and normalcy, but right now, they felt like abandoned pieces of someone who didn't leave by choice. Chloe moved toward the kitchen, her breath unsteady. The tea mug on the counter still carried a trace of heat. Not enough to burn, not enough to calm, just enough to confirm that Mara had been here moments before everything fell apart. She called Mara's name again, nothing. The stillness almost mocked her, taunting her with the possibility that she was already too late. The more she looked around, the more it felt like the room was holding its breath, waiting for her to understand the one thing she didn't want to accept. Something had gone terribly, violently wrong. And the worst part? There wasn't a single clue screaming for attention. Only empty space where a life should have been. This wasn't a disappearance. This was a vanishing. Chloe's breaths grew shorter as she stepped toward the hallway, calling Mara's name with a voice that kept cracking under the weight of dread. Every unanswered echo pushed her pulse higher. She moved from room to room, begging for any sign that Mara was simply caught up in something harmless. But every doorway, every empty corner, only sharpened the fear that had been gnawing at her since she saw that open door. She reached Mara's bedroom. The lights were off, but the curtains were slightly shifted, as though someone had touched them recently. The bed was still made. Nothing thrown around. Nothing knocked over. Nothing out of place except for the overwhelming sense that this room should not be so undisturbed. Chloe gripped the frame of the doorway, fighting the urge to scream. She checked the bathroom next, towels untouched, shower dry, no signs of use. Her mind raced. If Mara had left suddenly on her own, there would be some sign of chaos, some hint of confusion. But the stillness here felt deliberate, like someone had made sure nothing told a story. Her chest tightened again, not from fear this time, but from anger. Where was Mara? Who walked into her home? Who touched her things and left everything looking normal, except for the one fact that mattered most: Mara was gone. Chloe reached for her phone, hands shaking, ready to call for help because she knew, with gut-deep certainty, that waiting another second could cost more than she could bear. Somewhere in this quiet, something terrible had taken hold. And the silence only made it worse. By the time officers stepped into the apartment, Chloe's voice had already worn thin from panic. She pointed to everything: the tea mug, the keys, the drafting bag, each detail hitting her harder as she tried to explain why none of this matched the open door or the silence pressing down on them. One of the officers paused near the entryway, scanning the room with a look Chloe couldn't read. Another walked toward the living room, expecting signs of forced entry, a mess, anything that would follow the usual pattern. But they found nothing: no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle, just Mara's life, paused mid-sentence. Chloe kept repeating the same words through tears. She wouldn't leave. She wouldn't just walk out. But the room wasn't offering answers. It wasn't even offering clues. It felt like someone had walked in, erased every trace of themselves, and walked back out with Mara before anyone realized something was wrong. That reality hit Chloe with a force she wasn't ready for. One officer finally looked at her and said quietly, "We need to treat this seriously." But the seriousness wasn't the part that scared her. What terrified her was the emptiness, an emptiness that shouldn't exist when someone vanishes inside their own home. That emptiness held the first truth of this case. Nothing about Mara's disappearance was simple, and what Chloe found next would change everything. Before Mara Ellington's name ever appeared in news headlines, she was simply the person everyone trusted to make things work. Friends relied on her because she never made promises she couldn't keep. At work, colleagues admired her because she saw solutions long before problems became visible. She wasn't loud, and she never chased attention, but the people around her felt steadier when she walked into a room. Mara worked long hours not because anyone demanded it, but because she cared. She was the type who made detailed plans weeks in advance, not to control everything, but because she hated leaving people stranded. If she said she'd finish a design by Friday, it was done by Thursday. If she offered to help you move apartments, she'd show up early with snacks and a checklist. People loved her for that. Her apartment reflected the same personality: clean, organized, thoughtful, books arranged by subject, desks sorted neatly. Not an ounce of chaos in sight. That sense of order wasn't perfectionism, it was how she brought peace into her own life. When the world felt unpredictable, her routines grounded her. And that's what made her disappearance hit people so hard. This wasn't someone who vanished because of stress. This wasn't someone who walked out impulsively. If Mara changed plans even slightly, she always let someone know. Chloe used to joke that Mara was allergic to unpredictability. Everyone who knew her agreed, which is why the moment news broke that she was missing, her friends and co-workers felt a chill. It didn't match who she was. Not in the slightest. She lived with clarity, purpose, and intention. People like that don't simply disappear. If you're enjoying the story so far, take a moment to subscribe. This helps us bring you more cases just like this. Mara's talent didn't grow from luck or convenience. It came from years of effort that most people never saw. She spent late nights studying building codes, sketching redesigns, and pushing herself to understand every angle of her craft. To her, architecture wasn't about fame or prestige. It was about creating spaces that protected people, inspired them, and made their lives easier. She rose quickly, faster than anyone predicted. Not because she asked for opportunities, but because she earned them. Senior partners at her firm trusted her with projects usually reserved for people twice her age. They said she had an eye for detail that made structures safer and a sensitivity that made them feel alive. But the real reason she excelled was simpler: she cared enough to get things right. Her coworkers remembered how she would walk into a meeting with designs so well thought out that discussions moved smoothly. She wasn't loud. She didn't try to impress. She just delivered excellence every time, without cutting corners or overlooking things that mattered. And with every new project, every endorsement, and every challenge she overcame, the stakes quietly climbed higher. People depended on her. Her work mattered. Her decisions influenced entire teams and communities. But along with that responsibility came scrutiny. She reviewed budgets, structural reports, vendor lists, details most people skipped. She didn't. If something looked wrong, she called it out. If a contractor tried to hide shortcuts, she flagged it. Integrity guided every step. She didn't bend. She didn't compromise. She wasn't afraid to speak up, which made one thing very clear. A woman with this level of discipline does not vanish without a reason, and certainly not without leaving a trace. People admired Mara for her talent, but what truly set her apart was her backbone. She didn't just follow rules, she believed in them. She believed that safety mattered more than cost. That quality mattered more than speed. That protecting people mattered more than pleasing anyone in authority. There were moments at work when she caught small inconsistencies in reports, numbers that didn't add up, materials listed that weren't delivered, timelines that felt rushed. Most people would shrug, accept the explanation, and move on. But not Mara. If something felt off, she confronted it head-on. She wasn't rude. She wasn't dramatic. But she was firm. She would sit across from contractors or supervisors and calmly ask the kind of questions that made them shift in their seats. She didn't let vague answers slide. Her co-workers sometimes teased her, calling her the compass, because she always pointed toward what was right, even when it wasn't convenient, even when it slowed things down, even when it irritated people in higher positions. Her closest friends knew the truth. Mara's integrity wasn't stubbornness, it was protection. She wanted the buildings she designed to stand strong for decades. She wanted people to walk through them without fear. Cutting corners wasn't just sloppy, it was dangerous, and she refused to let danger hide under paperwork. This side of her made some people deeply respect her. It also made others uncomfortable, especially those who relied on shortcuts, inflated invoices, or quiet favors to keep their own profits steady. Her moral line was clear. She never crossed it. And that kind of conviction always draws attention, sometimes the wrong kind. Which is why the thought of her disappearing didn't feel random. Not to Chloe, not to her co-workers, not to anyone who knew what Mara stood for. She was the last person to walk away from her life. Chloe often said that Mara lived her life the way an engineer builds a bridge, steady, dependable, never leaving anything to chance. If she was running late, she texted. If she changed plans, she called. If she felt overwhelmed, she admitted it instead of disappearing. So when she didn't show up for work the next morning, people noticed immediately. Not because she was fragile, not because she was unpredictable, but because she had never, not once, broken routine without telling someone. Her team at the firm checked their calendars, emails, anything that might explain her absence. Nothing. No cancellations, no sudden appointments, no signs of stress. Her desk was tidy, her deadlines were on track, and she had even sent a late evening message about reviewing a structural report the next day. Everything pointed toward a woman who planned to live tomorrow like every other tomorrow she'd ever shaped, with control, care, and intention. That's why the news spread fast. People didn't wait 2 or 3 days to sound the alarm. They reacted within hours because they knew something was wrong long before the word missing appeared on paper. Mara didn't walk away from her life. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Something happened to her. Something she never saw coming. And the moment that truth settled in, everyone close to her understood one thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the start of a nightmare. If you'd like us to continue telling stories of people whose lives matter, make sure you subscribe. It helps us bring more cases like this into the light. For Chloe, the memory of that call doesn't fade. It doesn't blur. It doesn't soften. It sits in her mind with sharp edges, replaying exactly the same way every time she thinks about it. It was 9:47 p.m. when her phone lit up with Mara's name. Nothing unusual at first. They often checked in late at night, quick updates, small reminders, jokes about long workdays. But the moment Chloe picked up, she felt something press into her chest. Mara's greeting wasn't her usual calm, steady tone. There was a thin layer of tension under it, like she was trying to sound normal and failing. "Hey," Mara said, voice tight. "You up?" Chloe immediately sat up in bed. "Yeah. Why do you sound like that?" There was a pause, a short one, but long enough to worry her. "I'm almost home," Mara said finally, "just pulling up." Chloe heard the faint click of a turn signal through the phone, then breathing, uneven, not panicked, but unsettled. "You okay?" Chloe asked. Another pause, longer this time. "I don't know," Mara whispered. Something just feels off tonight. Chloe frowned, trying to read between the lines. Mara wasn't someone who spooked easily. She didn't call every time she walked to her car. She didn't overreact to shadows or sounds. If she said something felt wrong, she meant it. What do you mean off? Chloe pressed. Did someone follow you? Did you see something? But before Mara could answer, Chloe heard the soft rumble of Mara's engine slowing down, followed by silence on her end of the line except for her breathing. That was the last moment the conversation felt remotely normal. The last moment before everything shifted. Chloe listened carefully, trying to understand what was happening on the other end of the line. She could hear Mara shifting, the faint sound of her hand brushing against the phone, and the steady hum of her engine idling as she pulled into the lot near her building. But what struck Chloe most wasn't the noise, it was the silence between them. Mara sounded alert in a way that wasn't normal for her. Not fearful exactly, but wired, like every instinct she had was pushing her to pay attention to something just out of view. Mara, talk to me, Chloe urged, voice tightening. What's going on? I don't know, Mara said. The lights in the lot are on, but something feels wrong, like someone's watching me. Chloe's stomach dropped. Mara didn't say things like that lightly. She wasn't paranoid. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't jump at shadows. If her instincts were telling her something was off, Chloe trusted that feeling completely. Do you see anyone? Chloe asked. No, but... Hold on. The sound of her car door unlocking came through the line, then a moment of quiet breathing, the kind people make when they're trying to stay calm. I'm pulling up now, Mara whispered, barely above a breath. Something feels wrong. Those words hit Chloe harder than she expected. She sat up straight, gripping the phone tighter as her pulse picked up. She wanted details. She wanted answers. But more than anything, she wanted Mara to get out of that car and walk safely into her apartment. What do you mean wrong? Chloe pressed. Tell me what you're seeing. Mara never got the chance to finish her thought. Chloe waited for Mara to answer, holding her breath as the line sat in uneasy stillness. For a moment, all she heard was ambient noise, the faint rustle of clothing, the soft inhale of someone trying to make sense of their surroundings. It wasn't fear yet, but it was close. Too close. Then a sharp crackle burst through the speaker. Mara? Chloe said, sitting forward, pulse hammering. No reply. Just a sudden burst of static, loud enough to make Chloe flinch, the kind that happens when a phone shifts too fast, or when someone's hand hits the microphone by accident. But this didn't sound accidental, this sounded like the line was struggling to stay connected. Hey, talk to me, Chloe urged. Mara, say something. Another crackle. Then a muffled noise in the background, too soft to identify, too strange to ignore. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't footsteps. It was something else, something that didn't belong in a quiet parking area. Mara, what's happening? Chloe repeated, louder now. Silence. Chloe stared at her screen, frozen. The call was still active. The timer kept ticking, but no sound came through. Not even breathing. Then, without warning, the line cut. Not a gentle disconnect. Not a drop caused by bad reception. It snapped, shut clean. Abrupt. Mechanical. Call ended. Chloe's heart slammed in her chest. She immediately hit redial. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Voicemail. She tried again. And again. And again. Every unanswered ring felt like a countdown, like she was losing seconds she couldn't afford to lose. And the question that began clawing at her mind refused to let go. What did Mara see in those final seconds before the line went dead? Chloe stared at her phone long after the screen dimmed, refusing to accept what had just happened. Calls didn't end like that, not when someone was mid-sentence, not when they were outside their home, not when they had just said something felt wrong. She kept redialing, hoping the next call would go through, hoping she'd hear Mara's voice again, even if it was just a whisper. But it never connected. Not once. Her hands shook as she sat on the edge of her bed, trying to make sense of the last few minutes. Something had happened, she felt it in her chest. The tension in Mara's voice. The crackle of the line. The abrupt silence. None of it matched a normal dropped call. She replayed the conversation in her mind, line by line, moment by moment. Mara's breathing. The shift in her tone. The way she said something felt off. Chloe kept trying to convince herself she was overreacting, but fear drowned every attempt. She texted. She called again. She even tried video calling, praying it would force the phone to reconnect. Nothing. And that's when panic turned into certainty. That call wasn't an accident. Something interrupted Mara before she could finish her sentence. Something she didn't have time to describe. Something she saw or heard in those final seconds. Chloe grabbed her jacket and ran out the door. Because deep down she knew. If she didn't move now, she might be too late. If you've ever felt the dread of someone going silent at the wrong moment, make sure you subscribe. Staying with these stories helps keep their voices alive. By the time Chloe reached the apartment with the responding officers, her heart was racing so hard she could barely speak. She stood in the doorway, staring at a home that looked like it should have been filled with life but instead felt hollow, like something vital had slipped out of it. The first thing her eyes landed on were Mara's shoes, the same pair she wore every day when she got home from work, sitting neatly by the door, toes aligned, exactly where Mara always placed them. Shoes waiting for someone who didn't come inside. Just a few steps away, the drafting bag leaned quietly against the wall. That bag was practically an extension of Mara's arm. She never left it untouched unless she planned on staying home. But tonight it sat there with an odd stillness, straps resting flat, not a single paper disturbed. Chloe swallowed hard as she walked deeper into the apartment. Her voice trembled when she said, "She was here. She walked through this door." She pointed at the bag, then the shoes, then the table where the tea mug still sat. She never leaves things sitting like this unless she's settling in. One of the officers moved beside her, his expression tightening as he took in the room. "Nothing looks forced," he murmured. "No damage, no sign of struggle." "Exactly," Chloe replied, frustration threading through her tone. "This place should tell us something, anything." But the apartment didn't give them a story. It didn't even give them pieces of one. Everything stood in calm order, as if someone had removed the chaos that should have followed a disappearance. Chloe felt her stomach knot. How could a person be gone when the room they walked into looked untouched? Detectives moved through the apartment with quiet precision, careful not to disturb anything while they examined the space. Every corner they checked only raised more questions. There were no broken locks, no scratches on the doorframe, no marks on the windows, nothing that hinted at someone forcing their way inside. One of the officers crouched near the living room table, scanning the surface with a small flashlight. "Nothing out of place," he said. His voice carried zero relief, only confusion. If someone grabbed her, they didn't touch anything here. Chloe stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself, fighting the urge to scream. She didn't leave on her own, she insisted. She wouldn't walk out without sending a message. She wouldn't leave her things untouched like this. The detective nodded, but his eyes showed the same frustration she felt. Cases rarely started with absolutely nothing. Usually there was at least a misplaced object, a knocked-over chair, a dropped phone, something. But this apartment felt paused, as if someone pressed stop on Mara's life the second she stepped inside. The kitchen counters were spotless. Pillows on the couch were still aligned. A sweater folded on the armrest lay exactly the way she left it earlier that week. No smeared dirt on the floor. No signs of hasty movement. No trace of fear. It looked like a stage set for normal life, but normal didn't belong here anymore. One detective muttered under his breath, "How does someone disappear without leaving a single hint?" Chloe didn't answer. She couldn't. The silence of the apartment was suffocating her. The more they searched, the more unbearable it became. This wasn't emptiness. This was absence with intention behind it. Detectives began retracing the path Mara would have taken once she stepped inside. They followed the same steps she always did after a long day. Door, shoes, drafting bag, kitchen, living room. It should have painted a picture, some simple chain of events leading to her disappearance, but no matter how many times they walked the route, it led nowhere. One officer opened the small hallway closet expecting to find something knocked over. Nothing. Another gently moved the curtains in the living room, hoping they concealed a clue. Still nothing. Every detail they examined only confirmed the same unsettling truth. Mara didn't struggle, didn't rush, didn't panic. She entered the apartment and vanished, as if the moment she crossed the threshold, the world swallowed her whole. Chloe felt herself unravel inside as she watched them circle the room. "You keep checking the same places," she said, voice shaking. "There has to be something you're missing." "We're trying," one detective replied, but she could hear the strain in his tone. He was stumbling through a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "We expected to find anything. But this isn't behaving like a typical situation." Chloe rubbed her hands together to stop them from trembling. "She didn't just disappear. Something happened to her after she got inside. Or right before," one officer quietly added, glancing toward the door. That thought sent a fresh wave of panic through Chloe. The idea that whatever happened started the moment she stepped out of her car made everything feel even more terrifying. The detective turned to Chloe. "If something this silent can happen in a home this familiar, it means none of us ever truly see danger coming. If staying aware of cases like this matters to you, subscribe now. There are lessons in stories like these that none of us can afford to ignore." By the end of the search, the detectives had circled the apartment so many times that even their footsteps sounded uncertain. Each sweep of the room kept bringing them back to the same unsettling conclusion. The place held no story, no conflict, no trail. It looked like a home waiting for its owner to return, not a space where someone vanished. The lead detective stood near the center of the living room, hands on his hips, staring at nothing in particular. "We're looking at a disappearance without a starting point," he said quietly. "There's no entry, no exit, no interruption." Another officer added, "If someone took her, they did it without leaving a trace." Chloe pressed a hand to her forehead, fighting a wave of helplessness. "But how? How does someone just go?" No one answered. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. One detective checked the lock on the front door again, twisting it gently before inspecting the frame. No damage, no tampering. Whoever came through this door, if anyone did, they didn't force their way in. That sentence hit Chloe hard. Mara didn't open the door for strangers. She wasn't careless. So if no one forced entry, there was only one other explanation. Mara let someone in. Someone she trusted, or someone she didn't have time to fear. The room, so calm and so quiet, suddenly felt hostile, like it was guarding the one truth they needed most. The lead detective exhaled slowly. "This isn't a typical case. We're missing the beginning." But Chloe knew the beginning. It started with one sentence: "Something feels wrong." And whatever Mara sensed that night was still waiting to be uncovered. Garrett Beaumont didn't even know Mara was missing when detectives knocked on his door. He answered half asleep, still wearing the shirt he'd thrown on after getting home from his weekly poker game. When he saw the serious expressions on the officers' faces, confusion flickered across his features, then worry, then fear. "What happened?" he asked, voice rough and unsteady. "Is she okay? Did she call you?" The detectives didn't answer immediately. They watched him closely, studying every shift in his expression, every tightening muscle in his jaw, every breath he took. Even Chloe felt it. The air changed the moment Garrett appeared. Suddenly, he wasn't just Mara's fiancé. He was the first person everyone needed to rule out. Garrett tried to piece together what they were saying, but the more details they gave: Mara's open door, the abandoned drafting bag, the silent apartment, the more his face collapsed. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing, muttering, No, she'd never just disappear. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong." Chloe watched him, wanting to believe his shock was real, but the detectives had already shifted into interrogation mode. "You said you were out tonight," one officer noted. "Where exactly were you?" "With my friends. You can call them," Garrett replied quickly, almost too quickly. "We meet every Thursday." His voice trembled, but his hands didn't. And to seasoned investigators, calm hands meant either innocence or control. Chloe caught the glance the detectives exchanged. It wasn't spoken, but it was clear. He had just become their main focus. Within hours, people online were already pointing fingers, convinced they knew how these stories always ended. But nothing about Mara's life or her disappearance fit a familiar script. Garrett repeated his alibi at least 3 times before detectives even began writing it down. "I was at Mark's place. Poker night. Same as always," he said, voice strained but steady. "Ask them. They'll tell you." And they did. At first, when detectives called Mark, he confirmed it. So did Jesse. But then a third friend hesitated, stumbling over times. He said Garrett arrived late. Another insisted he showed up early. Someone else said he stepped outside several times during the night, something Garrett had failed to mention. Inconsistent timelines, conflicting details, minor gaps. But in a case this tense, minor didn't stay minor for long. The detectives leaned into the contradictions. "Why didn't you mention leaving the table?" one asked. Garrett blinked, caught off guard. I stepped out once to take a call. That's it. It wasn't important. But to investigators, everything was important. Every minute, every movement, every slight discrepancy carried weight. Chloe watched from across the room, her stomach twisting as Garrett tried to keep his composure. "You didn't tell us that earlier." The detective pressed. "I forgot," Garrett insisted. "I was overwhelmed. You told me Mara was missing. I wasn't thinking clearly." For detectives, it wasn't enough. And when the news leaked that his alibi had issues, the whispers started. Neighbors who barely knew Mara suddenly had plenty to say. Online threads exploded. Users wrote things like, "It's always the boyfriend," and "He's hiding something." Chloe felt sick reading them, torn between anger and dread. She didn't know what to believe. She didn't know if Garrett was lying, or just scared. But one thing was becoming dangerously clear. Once suspicion finds a target, it doesn't let go easily. Detectives didn't stop at Garrett's alibi. They moved quickly into every part of his relationship with Mara, searching for cracks they could call motive. And unfortunately for him, they found one issue that people love to latch onto: money. A few weeks before she vanished, Mara and Garrett had argued about finances. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, but enough for coworkers to remember tense moments. Mara had recently gotten a raise. Garrett hadn't. She wanted to save aggressively for a future home. He felt they should breathe a little, enjoy life, stop living as though the world was always on the verge of falling apart. It wasn't a battle. It was a disagreement normal for any couple. But when detectives learned about it, normal no longer mattered. "You two argued about money," one officer stated during questioning. "Everyone argues about money," Garrett shot back. It wasn't serious. But detectives didn't treat it like a passing disagreement. They treated it like fuel. Pressure. Possible resentment. Something darker, growing under the surface. Soon enough, the community got wind of it, and judgment spread fast. People who barely knew Garrett began crafting their own narratives. He resented her success. He felt threatened. It's always the partner. Chloe watched this unfold with disbelief. The story was slipping away from truth and into assumption, and no one seemed interested in stopping it. Garrett wasn't just the fiancé anymore. He was the villain in a story the public thought they already understood. Who do you think was responsible at this point? Drop a comment. Guilty or not guilty? But the reality was far more complicated. Because while everyone pointed at Garrett, someone else was paying attention to every mistake investigators made. By the end of the second day, Garrett's life had been turned inside out. Detectives searched his apartment, questioned his friends again, and requested access to his messages with Mara. They combed through every detail of his schedule, every purchase, every social media post. Anything that might support the growing suspicion around him. Garrett tried to cooperate, but with each request he grew more exhausted. His voice cracked during interviews. His eyes were swollen from barely sleeping. Chloe saw the toll it was taking on him. The man wasn't acting like someone hiding a crime. He was acting like someone drowning under the weight of everyone else's assumptions. The detectives, however, were locked onto him with tunnel-like focus. Their frustration with the empty apartment pushed them harder toward the only person who seemed to fit the narrative they were building. "Your timeline still has gaps," one officer insisted. "I've told you everything," Garrett replied, voice raw. "I didn't hurt her. I would never." But fear had already shaped the investigation. Facts were becoming interpretations. Missteps were being treated like confessions, and every inconsistency, no matter how small, was a spark ready to ignite into accusation. Online chatter grew louder by the hour. The community labeled him the prime suspect before the police even did. His face spread across posts with captions like, "This is the guy." He didn't leave his apartment except when detectives demanded it. People whispered about him in grocery stores. Someone even sent him a message saying he deserved to rot. But beneath all the noise, beneath the pressure crushing him from every side, one truth remained untouched. Garrett wasn't the only one connected to Mara's final night. Because while everyone stared at him, someone else watched from the shadows. The first real clue should have been impossible to miss. While photographing the entryway, a rookie officer spotted a faint clay-like mark along the lower part of the doorframe. It wasn't big, just a streak, a thumb's width at most, but it didn't fit the apartment. Mara didn't work with materials like that. She didn't track in mess. And her doorway had been spotless earlier that week, according to Chloe. "This looks different," the rookie muttered, leaning closer. The lead detective walked over, a spark of interest flickering in his expression. "Don't touch it," he said. "Get the macro lens. We need—" Too late. The rookie wiped it with the side of his glove. "I thought it was just dirt," he said, instantly realizing the mistake. "I was trying to clear the area for cleaner shots." The detective's jaw clenched. "That might have been your only usable clue." The room shifted. The mistake wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was devastating. One swipe had erased a mark that didn't belong in that apartment, something foreign, something that could have pointed them in a direction beyond Garrett. Chloe felt her stomach twist as she watched the detective stare at the now clean frame. "So that's it?" she asked softly. "It's gone?" No one answered. They didn't have to. This wasn't just a missing detail. This was the kind of error that changes outcomes. If a single overlooked clue can destroy an investigation, imagine what missing stories like this could cost you. Subscribe now so you don't get left in the dark. And if you refuse, tell us why in the comments. The detective exhaled sharply, frustration tightening his shoulders. "We move on," he said. But Chloe could tell something important had just slipped away forever. While the team continued processing the entryway, another officer crouched near the corner of the threshold. He spotted a tiny metallic fleck, barely larger than a grain of pepper. It clung to the floor as if it didn't belong there because it didn't. He picked it up with tweezers, held it against the light, and frowned. "What do you think this is?" he asked. The supervising detective barely glanced at it. "Probably house debris. Bag it, tag it, and move on." So it became item 17, a meaningless number in a long list of objects collected out of routine. No urgency, no analysis request, no follow-up. Had anyone bothered to look closely, they would have noticed that the fleck wasn't dust, wasn't paint, and wasn't from anything inside Mara's apartment. It had sharp edges. It had weight. It had purpose. But in the chaos of a disappearing person and mounting pressure to find answers, no one gave it more than a moment. Chloe watched from the hallway as they sealed it in a small bag. "Is that important?" she asked. "We collect everything," the officer replied. "Most of it turns out to be nothing." That response dug into her. They were already overwhelmed, distracted, trying to force the puzzle into a shape that pointed at Garrett. Anything that didn't fit that direction was brushed aside. Item 17 was placed into a cardboard box with the rest of the evidence and pushed to the back of a shelf. No one touched it again that day, or the next, or for years. It sat there forgotten while the investigation slowly collapsed around it. Had they understood what they were holding, the case would have changed overnight. But instead, the truth went into storage. The mood inside the precinct shifted after the two missed clues. Officers weren't saying it aloud, but the tension was spreading. Every conversation felt clipped, every update delivered with a hint of embarrassment. They weren't just losing time, they were losing confidence. Detectives started arguing over direction. Some insisted they should widen the search parameters. Others argued they needed to zero in on Garrett and push harder. The lead detective tried to rally the team, but even he sounded worn down, as if the case had aged him in a matter of days. One afternoon, Chloe arrived at the station hoping for progress. Instead, she walked into a heated discussion. "We're not getting anywhere because we're chasing the wrong angles," one detective snapped. "And I'm saying the fiancé's story still isn't airtight," another countered. "That doesn't make him responsible," the first replied. "We're ignoring possibilities." Their voices cracked with frustration. Their patience thinned. Their focus narrowed instead of expanding. Chloe stepped back, watching the debate spiral into something useless. Not one of them mentioned the missing smudge. Not one of them brought up item 17. They were arguing in circles, trapped by assumptions they were too tired or too stubborn to let go of. When she finally spoke to the lead detective privately, he rubbed his forehead and sighed. "We're doing what we can, Chloe." "It doesn't feel like you're looking in the right places," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. He just didn't agree either. The investigation wasn't collapsing because of a lack of clues. It was collapsing because no one was paying attention to the ones that mattered. And the longer it went on, the more the truth slipped out of reach. As days passed, the investigation lost its rhythm. Detectives who once rushed between leads now moved slower, their urgency fading under the weight of dwindling evidence. Calls stopped coming in. The media attention flickered out. Even the officers who'd once reassured Chloe with determined voices now avoided meeting her eyes. Boxes of evidence sat untouched on metal shelves, item 17 buried among them, forgotten behind layers of paperwork. The wiped smudge was no longer mentioned. It was as if the case had entered a quiet grave of its own. One by one, officers were reassigned to other files. New crimes, new priorities. Mara's disappearance slipped into the background, not because anyone stopped caring, but because the trail had gone cold enough to freeze movement entirely. Chloe felt the shift more than anyone. She stopped receiving updates unless she asked. She stopped hearing theories. Even the detectives who once promised they'd find her no matter what, now spoke in softer, more uncertain tones. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of a case losing its heartbeat. But the leads hadn't vanished. They were simply waiting for someone who knew how to see them. The official notice came on a quiet afternoon, delivered in a short, sterile email that Chloe reread at least 5 times before the meaning settled in her chest like concrete. Due to insufficient evidence and no active leads, the investigation into the disappearance of Mara Ellington is being reclassified as inactive. Inactive. Not solved. Not closed. Just set aside. Detectives didn't hold a meeting. No one called Chloe to walk her through the decision. It wasn't malicious. It was the slow, administrative way cases slip from urgency into storage when answers refuse to appear. When Chloe arrived at the station demanding to speak with someone, the lead detective stood there with a posture that said everything he didn't want to voice aloud. "We've hit every wall," he said gently. "We don't have the resources to keep pushing a path that isn't moving." Chloe stared at him like he'd spoken another language. How does a missing woman become just another file on a shelf? He didn't have an answer. He only had silence. The media eventually drifted away too. For weeks, Mara's photo had been everywhere: social feeds, flyers, evening news segments. Then, stories faded. Other tragedies took center stage. Attention shifted. People moved on. But Chloe didn't. She couldn't. She kept expecting the phone to ring, expecting a detective to show up at her door with a new possibility, expecting something, anything to prove that they weren't giving up. Instead, she was left with an empty apartment, a shrinking circle of support, and a case that felt frozen in time. Nothing about this felt resolved. Nothing felt final. It was just hollow. The world continued spinning while Chloe remained anchored to a moment that refused to release her. When the investigation went quiet, Chloe found herself drifting toward routines she never planned, rituals shaped by longing, fear, and refusal to let Mara slip away completely. Every morning before work, she stopped by Mara's apartment. She didn't knock anymore. She simply stood outside the door, fingertips resting on the frame, imagining the weight of the moments that used to fill that space. Mara humming while making tea, her keys jingling, in the soft click of her drafting pencils. Chloe stayed there for a minute or two, breathing slowly, letting memories anchor her before stepping back into a world that made less sense without her friend in it. At night, she called Mara's phone. She knew no one would answer. But hearing the voicemail, Mara's warm voice saying, "Hey, leave a message," gave her something to hold on to, something stable in the middle of a life that had cracked in half. Sometimes Chloe left messages. Sometimes she just listened. Sometimes she hung up after the first ring. Each time felt different, yet all of them felt necessary. She kept Mara's favorite mug on her kitchen counter, even though she never used it. The sight of it made her chest ache, but taking it down felt unthinkable, like admitting the story was over. While the rest of the community tried to return to normal, Chloe's days became built around these tiny acts. Not coping mechanisms, not hope, just ways to stay connected to the one person she refused to let fade into memory. People told her she needed to move forward, as if grief was something she could simply step over, but every attempt at normalcy felt like a betrayal. Her rituals weren't holding her back. They were the only things keeping her steady. Detective Sterling had always been steady, the kind of man who approached every case with calm logic and a quiet confidence that made people trust him. But after Mara's disappearance slipped into silence, something in him began to shift. He still showed up to work every day, but the certainty in his posture was gone. He avoided the entryway photograph pinned on the evidence board. He stopped making suggestions during briefings. And whenever someone mentioned the early missteps, the wiped smudge, the overlooked fleck, his jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened, and he shut down completely. Chloe noticed it the moment she saw him again months later. His eyes carried a heaviness that hadn't been there before, a kind of exhaustion that comes from replaying the same moment in your mind over and over, wishing you could reach back and change it. Sterling didn't admit his guilt outright. He didn't have to. His silence said everything. One afternoon, after another dead-end review of the case, he pulled the lead detective aside. Their conversation was low and strained, but Chloe caught fragments. "I should have caught it. We missed too much. I can't do this anymore." A week later, Sterling requested a transfer. No announcement. No goodbye. His desk was cleared overnight, leaving nothing but an empty space where his notes used to be. Someone else filled the spot within days, but the absence hung heavier than any file they archived. For Chloe, his departure felt like losing another piece of the fight for Mara. If the one detective who cared enough to lose sleep walked away, what hope was left? Sterling wasn't leaving because he didn't care. He was leaving because caring had broken him. The truth wasn't just lost, it was buried. Years moved forward, but the case remained frozen in the same place it had been the day it was archived. Seasons changed. New families moved into Mara's old building. The officers who once carried her file transferred, retired, or simply forgot. But Chloe didn't. Her life reshaped itself around absence. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone came with a shadow where Mara should have stood. She kept the same phone number for more than a decade, terrified that changing it would erase the last link to the voicemail she still played when the nights felt unbearable. She aged, but her grief never softened. It simply settled deeper, becoming part of her foundation, something she carried without showing, yet never stopped feeling. People stopped asking questions. Even the closest friends who once promised to never give up gently drifted away. Chloe remained the only constant. 17 years of silence. 17 years of unanswered questions. 17 years of waiting for a knock on the door that never came. If stories like this remind you how quickly truth can fade, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the ones that deserve to be remembered. Because time doesn't erase truth. It only waits for someone willing to uncover it. By 2017, the state's backlog of forgotten cases had grown too heavy to ignore. A new task force was formed designed not to chase fresh crimes, but to resurrect the ones time had smothered. Boxes sealed for decades were pulled from storage rooms, some so dusty the labels were barely legible. The directive was simple: review everything, reopen what deserved attention, and give families a chance at answers. It was a program driven by equal parts necessity and conscience. Too many files had slipped into silence, too many names reduced to case numbers. The goal wasn't just justice, it was correction. And in the middle of all those neglected folders sat one that had been untouched for 17 years. Mara Ellington, missing person, 2002. When the box was lifted from the shelf, it gave off a faint thud, as if the weight inside had never settled. Inside were the remnants of an investigation that had collapsed on itself. Scattered notes, outdated reports, worn photographs, overlooked evidence bags, and the unremarkable envelope that held item 17. Chloe didn't know it yet, but the moment that box moved from storage to a metal desk, something in the universe shifted quietly, but undeniably. The case that once suffocated under dead ends was being looked at through a new lens. Not by someone attached to the failures of the past. Not by someone who had spent years convincing themselves the trail had died. This time, fresh eyes would sift through the mistakes. This time, the story would be rebuilt from the ground up. The silence surrounding Mara's disappearance was about to break, and it started with a single box returning to the light. Detective Nia Holloway didn't look like someone who carried 17 years of someone else's failure on her shoulders. She walked into the cold case division with quiet confidence, no dramatic entrance, no loud declarations, just a presence that made people straighten up without realizing why. Where many detectives led with assumptions, Holloway led with questions. Where others relied on instinct, she relied on observation. She had a way of pausing at the right moment, scanning a room with sharp, steady eyes that caught the details most people would overlook. She didn't chase noise. She chased patterns. And she didn't care how old a case was. If something didn't add up, she pulled at it until it did. When she opened Mara Ellington's file, she didn't skim the summary like others before her. She laid out the reports, photos, and evidence bags in a clean line on the table, studying them piece by piece. She didn't react to the emotional weight of the case. She didn't comment on the tragedy or the years lost. She simply took in the facts with a measured calm. Her colleagues noticed immediately. One officer whispered, "She moves different." Another replied, "Give her a week, she'll find something everyone else missed." For Chloe, who had long given up expecting change, hearing the name Detective Holloway brought something unfamiliar, something she had pushed away for years, a flicker of hope, faint but real. Holloway wasn't distracted by past mistakes. She wasn't intimidated by the case's age. She wasn't influenced by the old theories that weighed it down. She was here to rebuild the story from scratch, and she was exactly the kind of person a buried truth needed. Unlike the detectives before her, Holloway didn't begin with interviews or theories or emotional backstory. She started with what couldn't lie. The evidence. She opened Mara's box and emptied it carefully onto the table. Bags were arranged in 2 rows. Items from the apartment on one side, items from Mara's car on the other. Old notes sat between them, pages yellowed around the edges, handwriting fading. Most detectives would have skimmed for familiar patterns. Holloway did the opposite. She slowed down. She lifted each bag, held it up to the light, and studied it as though it had something personal to say. The drafting bag, the tea mug, the keys. Nothing remarkable on their own, yet she treated each item with deliberate attention. When she reached the envelope labeled Item 17, she paused. It was thin, nearly weightless, something most people would dismiss without a second thought. She unsealed it and slid the small metallic fleck into her palm, turning it gently with a pair of tweezers. Under the fluorescent lights, it caught a faint shimmer. "Why did no one look closer at you?" she whispered. She pulled the original evidence log and frowned. Barely one sentence described the fleck. No analysis request. No follow-up. Just the bare minimum required to document its existence. Holloway leaned back in her chair, thinking, 17 years of waiting, and this tiny fragment had survived it all. She reached for her phone and called the lab. "I'm sending something down for a full workup. I want priority." The tech on the other end hesitated. "On a cold case?" "Yes," she said firmly. "On this one." Stay with this. Her discovery changed everything. And for the first time in years, the case wasn't stuck. It was moving. Holloway stayed late that night, long after the rest of the unit had gone home. The evidence table was still covered with bags and folders, but her attention stayed locked on the fleck from Item 17. She examined the photos from the original scene again, tracing lines, comparing angles, noting what was missing rather than what was present. Something wasn't adding up. The apartment looked untouched, too untouched. The entryway showed no marks, except for the one that had been wiped away. And now this small metallic fragment, overlooked and dismissed, refused to blend into the background. Holloway circled the table, piecing the facts together in her head. She didn't jump to conclusions. She didn't rush. She simply followed the logic the original team had abandoned in their desperation to find a quick suspect. When she finally closed the evidence box, she didn't look discouraged. She looked certain. This case hadn't been empty. It had been mishandled. And tomorrow, when the lab opened that envelope and ran the tests she requested, the silence surrounding Mara Ellington's disappearance would finally begin to crack, because the answer had been there the entire time, just waiting for the right eyes. When item 17 reached the lab, it sat in a small tray under bright overhead lights, a speck so tiny that most investigators would have overlooked it without a second glance. But the technician assigned to Holloway's request knew she didn't ask for priority testing unless she suspected real potential. He slid the fragment under the SEM-ED system scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, a long name for a powerful tool. In simple terms, it could look deeper than the human eye and identify exactly what something was made of, down to the elemental level. Running first scan, the technician murmured as he adjusted the controls. The machine activated with a soft hum, magnifying the speck thousands of times. On the screen, the fleck transformed from a meaningless dot into a jagged metallic shard, not dust, not paint. Something far more deliberate. The technician leaned closer. "Strange structure," he muttered. He ran a composition analysis. Bars on the screen began to climb as the machine identified elements: carbon, cobalt, tungsten. The pattern didn't fit any common household material. It didn't match automotive parts. It didn't resemble residue from the apartment. He paused the scan and called Holloway. "You might want to come down here." When she arrived, she studied the magnified image, then the data. "This isn't random," she said quietly. "Someone brought this into her home." It was the first moment in 17 years when the case offered something solid, something real. Not theories, not assumptions, not speculation. A metal fleck that refused to stay silent. And the test had only begun revealing what it truly was. The second scan finished with a sharp beep, and a new line of elemental data scrolled across the monitor. Holloway leaned in, eyes narrowing as the technician pointed to the results. "Tungsten," he said, "a significant amount." Holloway felt her focus sharpen. Tungsten wasn't common. Not in homes, not in consumer tools, not in anything an average person would carry through someone's apartment. The technician continued, "Look at the configuration. This isn't just tungsten, it's bonded with carbide. See these ratios? That's tungsten carbide alloy." Holloway exhaled slowly. This was big. Tungsten carbide wasn't casual. It wasn't random. It was engineered for specific purposes. Its main applications were in high-strength cutting tools, drilling bits, precision shaping equipment, gear used by professionals who dealt with tough materials. "This wouldn't show up on someone's shoes," Holloway said. "Not unless they worked with something heavy-duty." "Exactly," the technician replied. "Most people never come near this material. It's too specialized." Holloway studied the shard on the monitor again. Under high magnification, tiny grooves ran across its edge, grooves formed by intense friction, the kind produced when metal meets metal at high speed. "Someone brought this in from a job site," she concluded. "Not a random bystander. Someone trained. And if the alloy came from a tool used shortly before Mara vanished, then whoever left it behind had been close enough physically to leave that fleck in her doorway. Close enough to reach her. Close enough to follow her. Close enough to strike." Holloway's pulse quickened. This wasn't an accident. It was a signature. A signature the original investigators never recognized. And now, for the first time, the case had a direction, one forged in metal. The lab report arrived the next morning, and Holloway read it before she even removed her coat. The document confirmed everything she suspected and more. The shard wasn't a random piece of metal. It was dust from a tungsten carbide cutting tool, the kind used in high-precision industrial work, structural fabrication, heavy contracting, advanced machining. Not a tool a casual handyman could buy at a local store. This was specialized equipment, powerful, expensive, and typically found only in professional workshops. Holloway's mind started mapping possibilities. If this dust ended up in Mara's doorway, It meant someone who used these tools had stepped into her apartment or had contact with her shortly before she disappeared. She opened a database of tradesmen active in the area around 2002. Welders, metal fabricators, drill operators, contractors with licenses to use tungsten carbide equipment. The list was long at first, but Holloway filtered by geography, certification, and project history. The number shrank, from dozens to 12, from 12 to 5, from 5 to 3. Then she cross-referenced each remaining name with building projects near Mara's workplace, looking for any overlap. Her eyes locked onto one entry. A contractor who had worked on a renovation site directly connected to the arts center Mara frequently visited. A man whose business specialized in heavy-duty cutting tools that matched the alloy signature perfectly. A man with a history of working late, alone, with unrestricted access to industrial equipment. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't contamination. This was deliberate proximity. And the name at the top of the file wasn't just familiar to the area. This man wasn't just nearby. He was connected to Mara. The confirmation came back from the lab just after noon. Holloway opened the report slowly, scanning the data line by line until she reached the section that mattered most. Alloy composition, consistent with industrial cutting tools used exclusively by Vernon Thorne. Her jaw tightened. The report listed the exact percentages found in the fleck tungsten, cobalt, carbon matching the signature of tools registered to Thorne's workshop. Not similar, not approximate. A match. The kind of match that didn't leave room for guesswork. Holloway leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of it settle. 17 years ago, this fleck sat ignored in a storage box. 17 years ago, it could have changed the entire direction of the case. 17 years ago, one clue could have stopped the wrong man from being torn apart by suspicion. Now, finally, it had a voice. She looked again at Thorne's file, his projects, his access, his proximity to Mara, everything aligned with the precision of a key sliding into the right lock. This wasn't random. It was someone with skill and motive. For years, Vernon Thorne was the kind of man people waved to without thinking twice. He lived in the same modest house for over a decade. He attended local festivals, fixed broken railings at the park without charging a cent, and built porches for elderly neighbors who couldn't afford repairs. If you needed a contractor you could trust, his name showed up again and again. To the community he was steady, dependable, a man who minded his work and stayed out of trouble. When Holloway first pulled his file, nothing about him screamed threat. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. His business operated legally, paid taxes, and held the proper certifications. On paper, he was clean. But Holloway didn't care about paper. She cared about patterns. And Vernon Thorne's pattern had gaps, small ones, but enough to make her pause. His financial statements showed months where income dropped sharply with no explanation. His work logs listed projects completed alone, late at night, when most contractors would have packed up hours earlier. His supply orders fluctuated in ways that didn't make sense, massive purchases one month, almost nothing the next. To the untrained eye, it looked like a busy tradesman balancing unpredictable workloads. To Holloway, it looked like someone hiding instability behind a calm exterior. The deeper she went, the more she realized Vernon wasn't the humble craftsman neighbors adored. He was a man who survived by blending in so well that no one questioned him. And 17 years earlier, this quiet, dependable figure was working at the very place Mara had been reviewing for her audit. He wasn't a stranger on the outskirts of her life. He was close. Far closer than anyone ever realized. The Arts Center project had been celebrated as one of the town's proudest accomplishments, a modern space for performances, classes, and community events. Vernon Thorne's company was praised for its craftsmanship, finishing ahead of schedule and under budget. People talked about it like a local miracle. But Holloway wasn't interested in praise. She wanted numbers. She pulled old invoices, material logs, and inspection reports. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then she compared the amounts of materials billed with the amounts actually used. The difference wasn't small. Thousands of dollars in supplies had vanished on paper. Concrete quantities didn't line up. Metal beams listed as delivered never appeared in construction photos. Labor hours were inflated far beyond what the crew reported. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was intentional. Mara Ellington had been assigned to review the center's financials during her routine audits. According to internal emails Holloway uncovered, she flagged inconsistencies requiring clarification shortly before she disappeared. Her notes were concise, professional, and unmistakably concerned. The last person she contacted regarding those inconsistencies? Vernon Thorne. He replied with a short message, "Let's discuss this in person." It was the final email in the thread. No follow-up. No meeting notes. No resolution. Holloway felt her pulse quicken as she read through the correspondence. Vernon's calm, trustworthy facade no longer aligned with the paper trail. Instead, it pointed toward someone who'd quietly siphoned money from a high-profile project and who knew exactly what Mara had uncovered. To the community, he was the friendly contractor who fixed things. To Holloway, he was beginning to look like a man with everything to lose. And Mara Ellington had stepped directly into his path. The more Holloway pieced together, the more the picture sharpened into something unmistakable. Vernon Thorne wasn't just skimming money. He was siphoning significant amounts from the Arts Center project, enough to force him into financial collapse if discovered. And Mara, with her relentless accuracy and calm professionalism, was the kind of auditor who noticed every number that didn't make sense. Her internal notes showed the early stages of a storm she didn't yet realize she was walking into. She documented inflated costs, missing materials, discrepancies between vendor invoices and delivery reports. These weren't small errors. They were warning signs of a major scheme, one rooted in greed and hidden behind community trust. Holloway found one line in Mara's final audit draft that froze her in place. Vendor irregularities suggest intentional misreporting. Must meet with project contractor immediately. Project contractor, Vernon Thorne. He didn't just have a reason to shut her down. He had every reason. If her audit reached the next stage, the entire scheme would collapse. Vernon would lose his business, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. He had no margin for exposure. Holloway reviewed witness statements from 2002 and noticed something chilling. Vernon had been seen near the Arts Center the same week Mara disappeared, working after hours, supposedly fixing structural issues no one else had reported. He had opportunity. He had access. He had motive strong enough to reshape a man's life into desperation. And Mara, unknowingly, had stepped right into the center of his secret. You'll want to hear this. What he did next changed everything. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment to fix that. And if you refuse, tell us why in the comments. I'm watching. Holloway closed the file. The mask was slipping, and the truth was closing in. Holloway stared at the final lab summary, letting its clarity settle like a stone dropped into still water. The alloy from item 17 wasn't similar to Vernon Thorne's tools, it was identical. Every percentage lined up. Every element matched the equipment registered to his workshop. This wasn't coincidence. It was a signature. She pulled up the supply orders from the Arts Center project. The same tungsten carbide tools used on site were the ones Vernon continued using in his personal workshop. He'd never changed suppliers, never changed brands. His consistency, once a mark of pride, now tied him directly to the trace material found inside Mara's entryway. Holloway moved next to the timeline. Emails, calls, site access logs, Mara's pending audit, Vernon's unexplained late-night work sessions. It all clicked into a structure that left no gaps. The man the community trusted had built his image on modest charm and steady labor, but behind that calm exterior was a truth he'd buried for 17 years, one that had finally surfaced. Unmasking who he was had taken time, but what he eventually confessed was far worse than anything Holloway expected. Holloway arrived at Vernon Thorne's workshop just after sunrise, the warrant still warm from the printer. The building sat at the edge of his property, plain exterior, nothing unusual, nothing that would make a passerby question what went on inside. But Holloway already knew better. She pushed open the door, and the moment she stepped in, the air felt thick with purpose. The space was cramped, crowded with heavy machinery, sawdust, metal shavings, and half-finished projects. At first glance, it looked like any contractor's workspace, busy, chaotic, lived in. But Holloway wasn't looking for tools. She was looking for traces, and she found them. Near the back wall, she spotted a bench where Vernon kept his precision cutters. The table was dusted with a powder that glittered faintly when her flashlight passed over it. She scraped a small sample into an evidence vial. The composition looked familiar, too familiar. Then she moved to the lower shelf, where several containers of construction compound sat stacked. One jar had a faint smear on its lid. Holloway opened it and stared down at a thick, gray mixture. Her pulse jumped. It was the same type of industrial clay that had been wiped by accident off Mara's doorway 17 years earlier. The evidence wasn't screaming. It was whispering. But the message was unmistakable. Every step she took through that workshop painted Vernon Thorne into a corner he couldn't slip out of. The dust, the clay, the tools, the proximity, the access. The mask hadn't fallen yet, but it was starting to fracture. And Holloway knew the next move had to be precise. The lab results returned faster than Holloway expected. Each page tightened the noose around Vernon Thorne's story. The metal dust gathered from his workshop matched the tungsten carbide signature from item 17 with absolute precision, not similar, not close, identical. The clay smear confirmed it too. Same compound, same brand, same mineral profile as the faint trace that had once clung to Mara Ellington's doorway before it was mistakenly wiped away. 17 years between them, yet the chemical fingerprint aligned as though both samples had been taken on the same day. Holloway walked into the interrogation room with the stack of results under her arm. Vernon sat at the metal table, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. He tried to look calm, but his eyes shifted too quickly, landing on everything except her. She slid the reports in front of him. "Your tools match the residue found at Mara's home," she said. "And the clay you keep in your workshop? Same as the trace left the night she vanished." Vernon didn't blink. He didn't speak. But something in him faltered just a fraction, but enough for Holloway to see the crack form. She continued. "You claimed you were at poker night the entire evening," she said, voice steady. "But your truck was caught on traffic cameras heading toward the Arts Center at 9:41 p.m., 6 minutes before Mara called her fiancé." His hands clenched, not a word left his mouth. Silence can be louder than any admission. And Vernon's silence right now sounded like guilt finally fighting its way to the surface. Holloway placed a new set of documents on the table quietly, without drama. Vernon kept his eyes fixed on the wall, but she could see the stiffness in his posture. He knew something was coming. "This," she said, tapping the first page, "is the sign-in sheet from your poker game. You left at 9:12 p.m., not midnight, not even close." She slid the second page toward him. "This is footage of your truck passing Cortlandt Avenue at 9:41 p.m. Another page. "And this is the materials ledger showing you checked out structural compounds from the Arts Center earlier that week, compounds that match what we found in your workshop." Vernon's breathing hitched. A single tremor passed through his fingers, as if his body answered before his voice could. Holloway leaned in slightly, not threatening, just close enough that he felt the pressure. "Vernon," she said softly, "you weren't home. You weren't at poker night. You were with Mara." His jaw tightened, his eyes closed, his shoulders sagged like a man finally too tired to keep holding up the same lie. He whispered, barely audible at first. She wasn't supposed to fight." Holloway froze. There it was. The first crack widening into a collapse. Vernon pressed his palms to his forehead, voice shaking now, words tumbling out in broken pieces. "She found things she shouldn't have. I needed more time. I didn't mean for it to go that far." He wasn't confessing calmly. He was unraveling under the weight of the truth he'd carried for 17 years. And right here, right at this moment, viewers must not miss what comes next. Subscribe so you never miss a break like this. If you won't, comment why. Holloway steadied her voice. "Tell me where she is." Vernon didn't lift his head at first. He sat with his hands covering his face, breathing unevenly, as though speaking the next words would break whatever was left of him. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and defeated. "It's behind the workshop," he said quietly. "The slab, the one near the drainage line." Holloway felt the room still around her. She knew exactly which slab he meant, a broad rectangle of thick concrete she'd walked past that morning without a second thought. Nothing about it looked unusual. Nothing suggested it concealed a grave. Vernon continued, voice unsteady. I poured it that night. No one saw, no one asked. They trusted me. The confession wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It landed with the weight of a truth too heavy to carry for nearly 2 decades. Holloway didn't respond right away. She wrote the location down, closed her folder, and stood. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to unearth from him. The ground behind that workshop held the rest. And the community was nowhere near ready for the truth that was about to surface. When the news broke, it spread across the town like a tremor, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Vernon Thorne, the dependable contractor who had built playsets for neighborhood kids and repaired fences without asking for payment, was led away in handcuffs. People watched from porches and windows, stunned into silence. Some whispered his name like it belonged to a stranger. Others refused to believe it entirely, shaking their heads as though the sight of him being placed in the back of a patrol car was some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. The man they trusted had been hiding a truth darker than anything they imagined. Within an hour, local forums were filled with disbelief. Parents who once welcomed him inside their homes now felt uneasy, replaying old memories with new suspicion. A few defended him at first. There must be some misunderstanding, but as details leaked from the investigation, hope faded. The betrayal cut deep. For years, Vernon blended into the background of daily life, fixing things, lending tools, waving hello. It made the revelation even harder to swallow. People questioned themselves as much as they questioned him. How could they have missed it? How could someone so ordinary carry something so devastating? At the grocery store, at coffee counters, at gas pumps, the same sentence passed from person to person. 17 years, and he lived among us like nothing happened. No one felt untouched by the news. A man they believed in had shattered that trust with one horrifying truth. And for the first time since Mara vanished, the town felt the full weight of what had been stolen, not just a life, but the sense of safety they assumed they had. Garrett Beaumont didn't find out from an officer, a press conference, or even a phone call. He learned the truth the same way everyone else did, through a headline. Local contractor arrested in 2002 disappearance of Mara Ellington. He read the sentence twice, then a third time, as if his eyes refused to trust what his mind already understood. The weight he'd carried for 17 years didn't lift instantly. It shifted slowly, like gravel pouring off a buried foundation. He sat down at his kitchen table, hands trembling, not from shock but from the sudden absence of a burden he'd grown used to. There was no public apology waiting for him, no official statement acknowledging the years he spent shadowed by whispers. No officer came to say, "We were wrong." The silence around him felt both familiar and infuriating. People in town reacted awkwardly when they saw him. Some offered tight nods, avoiding eye contact. Others muttered a quick, embarrassed greeting before hurrying away. A few tried gentle words. "We always hoped you were innocent," or "You seemed like a good guy." But Garrett knew what they weren't saying. They had doubted him. Many still carried guilt about it. He didn't lash out or demand apologies. He simply walked through town with a tired expression, the kind of look worn by someone who survived a storm no one else noticed. Late that evening, he stepped outside and sat on his porch. For the first time in years, the night felt quiet instead of crushing. Vernon Thorne's arrest didn't give him back the time he lost, or erase the accusations that chipped away at him, but it gave him something he hadn't felt in years: room to breathe. And though the town never said it aloud, they knew his name was clear. Chloe sat in the precinct's quiet room, hands folded tightly in her lap, as Holloway walked her through the final timeline. Each detail landed with a mix of relief and heartache. For years, she had rehearsed every possible scenario in her mind, searching for a version that made sense. Now, the truth stood in front of her, painful, solid, undeniable. Holloway explained how Mara made it home that night, how she sensed something was wrong, and how Vernon Thorne confronted her before she even reached the door. Chloe listened without interrupting, tears sliding down her face in steady lines. Not from shock she had carried grief for so long it had become part of her, but from the weight of finally knowing. The hardest part wasn't the confession, it was learning how close the answer had always been. One tiny fleck of metal, ignored in 2002, had been the key to everything. Item 17 had done what time, searches, and interviews couldn't. It gave her Mara back, even if only in truth. Holloway placed the evidence photo between them. "This was the turning point," she said softly. "This is how we found him." Chloe brushed her thumb across the corner of the image. 17 years, she whispered, and it came down to something that small. Closure didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a long breath she had avoided taking for nearly 2 decades. Pain and peace braided together, creating a silence that felt strangely full. Before the moment ended, here's a truth viewers shouldn't ignore. Don't miss the next case we uncover. Subscribe now, or tell us in the comments why you won't. Chloe closed her eyes, letting the final pieces settle inside her. She finally had her answer. In the end, justice didn't arrive through some dramatic breakthrough or a sudden confession shouted across a room. It came from a speck small enough to overlook, quiet enough to forget, yet powerful enough to hold the key to a 17-year mystery. Item 17. A single fleck of metal, ignored during the original investigation, carried the truth patiently through time. It outlasted doubt, suspicion, grief, and silence. It waited in a cardboard box, untouched, until someone with fresh eyes and unwavering resolve finally listened to what it had been trying to show all along. For the town, the case altered more than the way they saw Vernon Thorne. It changed the way they valued details, the way they judged one another, and the way they understood the weight of every overlooked moment. Trust didn't return overnight, but clarity did. For Chloe, Garrett, and everyone who loved Mara, the truth didn't heal everything. It simply opened the door to peace, something they'd been denied for far too long. And for Holloway, it became a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. One small clue, one relentless pursuit, and a truth that refused to stay buried.